The room didn't go quiet immediately. It fractured first. Glances exchanged. Screens paused mid-scroll. Someone almost spoke, then didn't, because everyone had heard it. "I'm in charge. You're fired." It wasn't just the words, it was the timing, the tone, the confidence of someone stepping into authority that didn't quite fit, like a key turning in the wrong lock. She didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't even ask a question. She simply nodded, as if confirming something only she could see, unclipped her badge, and placed it on the desk with a precision that felt intentional. No emotia, no hesitation, no scene. And that's when the discomfort started, because in offices like this, people don't leave quietly unless they know something others don't. 3 hours later, that silence would begin to explain itself. But at that moment, standing under fluorescent lights, with the system still humming like nothing had changed, one thing had already shifted. This wasn't a decision. It was a trigger. By 9:12, the office had reorganized itself around an absence no one was prepared to acknowledge. Her desk remained untouched, not cleared, not reassigned, not even questioned, just paused, like a system waiting for an input it hadn't received yet. The acting director moved quickly, too quickly, issuing instructions with the clipped efficiency of someone performing authority rather than holding it. Meetings were reshuffled, access rights reviewed, a few quiet calls placed behind glass doors. Optics mattered, control mattered more. "Transition protocol," she said at one point, not looking up from the screen. "We proceed as planned." No one asked which plan, because there hadn't been one yesterday, and that detail, small, almost administrative, began to settle into the room like dust no one could quite see, but everyone could feel. At 9:47, IT received the request: deactivate user profile, immediate effect, no escalation note attached, no dual authorization. Just a single line of instruction, signed under temporary authority. The technician hesitated. Not long, just enough. Because the name on the request wasn't just another employee, it was tied to 3 active systems, 2 external partners, and a contract layer that most people in the building preferred not to touch unless absolutely necessary. He glanced at the internal policy panel. Section 11, Delegation Limits. Authority can be reassigned, access can be transferred, but continuity validation required dual confirmation. He hovered over the screen, then looked at the signature again. Acting Director. Technically valid, procedurally unclear. He clicked Proceed. And just like that, a single action, barely audible, the system registered a change that wouldn't stay local for long. By 10:03, the first anomaly appeared. Not an error, a delay. A report that usually processed in seconds stalled at 62%. Then reset, then stalled again, no alert triggered, no escalation flagged, just a subtle interruption in a workflow that had been stable for years. "Probably load," someone said. It sounded reasonable. It wasn't. At 10:26, a partner dashboard in another city displayed a quiet notification: authorization pending. No explanation, no context, just a pause where there had never been one before. Back in the office, the acting director adjusted her schedule again. "Keep things moving," she said, sharper now. "We don't need bottlenecks today." No one mentioned the delays, not yet, because they were still small enough to ignore, still quiet enough to dismiss, still early enough to pretend. But systems like this don't fail loudly at first. They hesitate, they repeat, they remember. And somewhere between a paused report and a pending authorization, a boundary had already been crossed, not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally, and structures don't react immediately. They accumulate. The first real consequence wouldn't arrive as a crash. It would arrive as a question no one could answer, and when it did, the room would realize something far more uncomfortable than a mistake had just occurred. Not a failure, a violation. By 10:58, the question finally surfaced. Quietly at first. A single message in an internal channel. "Does anyone know why partner access is showing pending?" No urgency, no alarm, just confusion. It sat there for 12 seconds before the first reply appeared. Temporary sync delay. Confident, clean, wrong, because by then it wasn't one dashboard anymore, it was 3. At 11:07, Finance noticed, not through alerts, through absence. A scheduled transfer didn't execute, no error code, no rejection, just nothing. As if the system had paused mid-decision and refused to continue. Try again, someone said. They did. Same result. The transaction hovered in a state no one had a name for, neither approved nor declined, just suspended, waiting for something that no longer existed. At 11:19, the acting director was informed. She didn't look up immediately, finished typing, sent the email. Then, what exactly is the issue? The phrasing mattered, because it assumed there was one issue, singular, isolated, containable. There are delays across partner systems, the analyst said carefully, and finance is seeing non-execution on scheduled flows. A pause. How many systems? Another pause. 3, possibly 5. The room shifted. Not physically, structurally, because 5 meant it wasn't local anymore. 5 meant it was connected. Then isolate it, she said, sharper now. Restrict external access if needed. There it was, the second decision, faster than the first, cleaner, more dangerous, because isolation, in systems built on continuity, doesn't contain problems, it amplifies them. At 11:26, IT initiated partial restriction, access layers tightened, external endpoints limited, authentication cycles reset. For a moment, a brief, almost convincing moment, things appeared to stabilize. The dashboard refreshed. One report completed, a notification cleared. See? Someone exhaled. It's resolving. It wasn't. At 11:32, the first rejection appeared. Not inside the company. Outside. A partner system flagged, authorization invalid, signature mismatch. That wording didn't belong to internal errors. That wording came from contracts, from external validation layers, from systems that didn't care about internal titles or temporary authority. They cared about continuity, and continuity had just been broken. By 11:41, the pattern became undeniable. Every process that required her signature had stopped recognizing the system. Not failed, not crashed, just refused. Like a door that no longer acknowledged the key. In the glass conference room, voices dropped, not louder, lower, measured, because the realization was forming, slowly but precisely. This wasn't a technical issue, it was structural misalignment, and structural misalignments don't resolve with restarts, they escalate. At 11:48, someone opened the policy archive, not out of panic, out of instinct. Scrolled past onboarding rules, access matrices, standard protocols, then stopped. Section 11, Delegation Limits. The same clause IT had hovered over earlier, the one no one had said out loud yet. Authority may be reassigned under temporary absence, someone read quietly, but execution rights tied to external validation require continuity verification and dual authorization. A silence followed. Not empty, waited, because suddenly the sequence mattered, the firing, the access removal, the missing confirmation. Across the table, someone finally said it. She was the continuity. No one corrected them. And in that moment, the narrative shifted. From something is wrong to something was done. Deliberately, procedurally, incorrectly. At 11:56, the first external escalation request arrived. Subject line, request for clarification, authorization disruption. Polite, neutral, but underneath it, pressure, because external partners don't ask questions unless something already affects them, and when they do, they're not asking for explanations, they're measuring risk. Inside the room, no one was looking at the acting director anymore, not directly. But the distance had appeared, subtle, irreversible, because authority isn't just declared, it's validated. And somewhere between a badge placed on a desk and a system waiting for continuity, that validation had quietly disappeared. The next step wouldn't be internal, it would be visible. And once it became visible, it wouldn't be contained. By 12:03, no one was pretending anymore. Not in messages, not in meetings, not even in the way people held their posture, slightly forward now, as if anticipating impact rather than managing process. Because the system wasn't stabilizing, it was revealing. Each delay, each rejection, each pending status wasn't random. It was consistent, precise, almost deliberate, like a structure following its own logic, one that had just been triggered. By 12:14, verification had already begun, just not inside the building. Because while the acting director was drafting statements and tightening controls, external systems were doing something far less visible. They were checking. Quietly, methodically, without urgency, because they didn't need it. They had rules, and rules don't rush. At 12:18, the first confirmation request reached legal. Not internal legal. External. A partner-side compliance unit. Subject line: Continuity verification, Clause Section 11 invocation. That phrasing didn't belong to daily operations. That phrasing meant escalation had moved beyond discussion, into structure. Inside the office, no one saw it arrive, not immediately, because internally, the narrative was still being managed. "We'll resolve this," the acting director said, pacing now. "We just need alignment. Alignment, a clean word. Neutral, comforting, but alignment assumes the system is still adjustable, and by that point, it wasn't. At 12:23, the compliance unit did what systems like that are designed to do. They pulled the chain. Authorization logs, signature continuity, delegation records, every layer that connects decision to permission. And there it was. A gap, small on the timeline, massive in implication. At 9:12, termination recorded. At 9:47, access revoked. No dual authorization, no continuity validation, no transition signature, just a break. Clean, unverified. Back in the office, the first visible crack appeared. A call that didn't connect, not dropped, not failed, simply not routed, because routing requires recognition, and recognition requires continuity. "Try again," someone said. They did. Same result. At 12:31, finance escalated internally, not loudly, but formally. "We need authorized confirmation to proceed." The wording mattered, because for the first time, the system wasn't just hesitating. It was asking, and no one in the room could answer with certainty. The acting director stopped pacing. "For what exactly?" she asked. "For execution rights," came the reply. "The system no longer recognizes the current authorization chain." A pause. Then, sharper. "I am the authorization." It sounded correct. It wasn't sufficient. Because authority declared inside a room is not the same as authority validated across systems. At 12:36, the second external response arrived. This one no longer neutral. Authorization rejected, continuity requirement unmet. No explanation, no negotiation, just a conclusion. And that's when the room changed, not in noise, in temperature. Because up until that moment, there was still space for interpretation. Now there wasn't. Now there was a statement. External, independent, final. Someone reopened the policy archive, scrolled directly to Section 11, read it again, slower this time. As if the words might adjust under pressure. They didn't. Because clauses like that aren't written for clarity. They're written for moments exactly like this. Across the table, a realization surfaced. Not spoken, but shared. The system hadn't failed. It had complied. At 12:42, the acting director finally stopped issuing instructions, not because there was nothing left to do, but because every next step required something she didn't have. Validation. And validation, once broken at the structural level, cannot be recreated internally. Somewhere outside the building, a report was already being prepared, not about performance, not about delay, about risk, measured, documented, assignable. Inside, no one said it yet. But everyone understood. This was no longer about control, it was about exposure, and exposure, once it becomes visible, doesn't reverse. It expands. The next move wouldn't come from inside the room. It would arrive from someone who didn't need to ask permission, someone who didn't rely on interpretation, someone who would look at the sequence, clean, time-stamped, undeniable, and reduce it to one conclusion, not emotional, not personal, just precise. And when that conclusion landed, it would redefine everything that had just happened. By 12:57, the conclusion arrived, not as a call, not as a meeting, as a document. It entered the system quietly. No announcement, no escalation banner, just a new file appearing in legal's queue with a timestamp that immediately drew attention. Preliminary Compliance Assessment, Delegation Section 11. No one spoke when it was opened, because titles like that don't ask for discussion, they define it. The first page was brief, structured, neutral, but every line carried weight. Timeline validated, delegation recorded, continuity requirement unmet. No adjectives, no interpretation, just sequence. And sequence, when aligned like this, doesn't leave space for argument. At 13:02, the second page clarified what the room had been avoiding. Execution of termination under temporary authority exceeded delegated scope. A pause, then the line that settled everything. Result: actions classified as unauthorized at structural level. No one needed translation, because structural level doesn't mean a mistake, it means a breach of design. Across the room, someone exhaled slowly. Not relief, recognition. Because once something is classified structurally, it moves beyond internal resolution. The acting director read it twice, not quickly, carefully, as if precision could soften the outcome. It didn't. "What does this mean operationally?" she asked. The question sounded procedural. It wasn't. It was the last attempt to frame this as manageable. Legal didn't answer immediately, they didn't need to rush, because the document already had. "Operationally," someone said finally, "it means all dependent actions are now under review." A beat. "Externally." That word landed heavier than anything before it. Externally, because internal processes can be adjusted, external reviews cannot. At 13:08, the third page loaded. Shorter, sharper, final. Immediate requirement: restore validated authorization chain prior to any further execution. A silence followed. Not the earlier kind, uncertain, searching. This one was different. Closed. Because for the first time since 9/12, the path forward was clear. Not easy, not comfortable, but defined. Across the table, someone said it. Quietly. "We need her." No one challenged it. Because every system, every delay, every rejection had been pointing to the same conclusion from the beginning. Continuity wasn't optional, it was embedded. At 13:12, another notification appeared. External again. This time not a question, not a request, a status. Process hold initiated, pending authorized continuity. Inside the room, no one moved immediately. Because movement now required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required something few people are comfortable with in moments like this: reversal. The acting director closed the document, not abruptly, deliberately, as if controlling the motion could preserve control of the situation. It couldn't. Because the structure had already made its decision. Not loudly, not emotionally, just correctly. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, the office continued to function. Emails sent, calls scheduled, screens glowing. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside the system, where authority is measured not by titles but by validation, everything had. And now, there was only one variable left, not technical, not procedural, human. The next step wouldn't involve escalation, or explanation, or control. It would involve something far more difficult to execute, admitting where the boundary had been crossed, and deciding what to do with the person who had crossed it. Because in structures like this, consequences don't arrive as punishment, they arrive as alignment. And alignment was already in motion. By 1326, the room had stopped searching for alternatives, not because there were none, because none of them worked. Every scenario circled back to the same point. Every workaround collapsed under the same condition. Every temporary fix triggered the same response: authorization pending. The system wasn't resisting, it was waiting. Outside, the building looked unchanged, glass reflecting afternoon light, meetings still scheduled, conversations still happening in low, controlled tones. But inside the structure, where decisions are translated into execution, everything had narrowed to a single requirement: continuity. At 1331, the CEO's assistant entered the room. No urgency in the movement, no raised voice, just a message delivered with the kind of precision that signals something final has already been decided. "He's reviewing the report." No one asked which report, they all knew. The acting director nodded. Once. Then stepped back from the table for the first time since morning, not out of fatigue, out of distance, because somewhere between the first command and the last document, the position had shifted, subtly, irreversibly. At 1338, the system updated. No alert, no sound, just a change in status across multiple panels. Execution locked, awaiting primary authorization. Primary, not acting, not temporary, not assigned. Primary. Across the room, someone leaned back slightly, not relaxed, certain, because the architecture had now made its position explicit. No interpretation left. No ambiguity remaining. At 1342, a call was placed, not through standard channels, not scheduled, direct. No one heard what was said, but they saw the result. A single field, previously inactive, flickered back into visibility across the system. Name restored, not fully, not yet, but recognized. And that was enough, because recognition is the first step of alignment. At 1347, the first process resumed. Not all, just one. A report that had stalled hours earlier completed instantly. No delay, no recalculation, as if it had simply been waiting for permission to exist. No one commented. They didn't need to, because the pattern was now undeniable. At 1352, the CEO entered. No announcement, no sopravvejdia, just presence. And presence in rooms like this carries its own authority. He didn't sit immediately, didn't ask for updates, just looked at the screen, then at the document still open, then at the timeline, clean, ordered, exact. "Section 11, he said finally. Not a question, a reference. Legal nodded, once. A pause followed, not long, but complete. Authority was exceeded. The same words, but now, confirmed. Silence didn't fill the room. It settled into it, heavy, structural, final. No one defended, no one explained, because explanation implies uncertainty. And there wasn't any left. The CEO closed the file, looked once more at the system, at the status, at the dependency that had been removed, and was now partially returning. "Restore continuity," he said, simple, direct, non-negotiable. Then, after a brief pause, "and we'll address the rest." No emphasis, no threat, just sequence. Because in structures like this, resolution comes first, consequences come after. The acting director didn't respond, not immediately, because there was nothing procedural left to say. Only one realization remained: authority isn't proven when it's used, it's proven when it's recognized. And recognition cannot be declared. At 1403, the system stabilized, not gradually, instantly. Statuses cleared, processes resumed, connections re-established. From the outside, it looked like a recovery, clean, controlled, efficient. But inside the structure, something had been permanently recorded, not in logs, not in reports, in understanding. Because from that moment on, no one in that room would ever confuse assigned authority with actual control. And somewhere, quietly, without announcement or confirmation, alignment had completed, not perfectly, but precisely. Silence.